For 6 minutes and 32 seconds, a corridor across the Sahel, 300 kilometers of desert stretching from the Niger border to the outskirts of Ouagadougou, simply vanished from Western surveillance grids. No malfunction, no storm, just silence. Silence where there should have been a signal. Silence where the world's most powerful eyes failed to see. And by the time the feed returned, something had already moved, something no one was meant to witness. October 10th, 2025. Intelligence officers in Langley, Paris, and Brussels spent the next 72 hours trying to reconstruct what crossed that blind spot. They scrubbed satellite logs, they replayed infrared footage, they compared shadows and dust signatures frame by frame. But the answer was not in their databases. It was already on the ground. A convoy, 23 vehicles, no insignia, no transponders, Chinese-made fire support systems, 70-kilometer range rocket launchers, armored coordination carriers, tactical supply trucks hauling something heavier than steel. The end of permission. For decades, Africa was told, wait for approval. Depend on aid, borrow your own security. As if sovereignty were a subscription service that powerful nations could cancel whenever they pleased. But in those 6 minutes and 32 seconds, that script was rewritten. Not with speeches, not with summits, but with engines moving through darkness as if the desert itself had been guiding them. Western analysts called it a breach of protocol. Beijing said nothing. But across the Sahel, the message was unmistakable. Dependency had been buried in the desert, and no one had asked permission to dig the grave. Because power fears many things: rebellion, resistance, disruption. But what it fears most is irrelevance. And when a continent stops waiting to be protected and simply protects itself, the world must choose: catch up or be left behind. The engine started at 200 hours. No headlights, no radio chatter, just a faint red glow from instrument panels slicing through the Sahel's absolute dark. From northern Ouagadougou to the road toward Kaya, the convoy moved like a shadow that had learned to carry weight. Inside the lead vehicle sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 36 years old, a soldier who became a statesman not through ambition, but through exhaustion. Exhaustion from watching too many promises fall apart under the Sahel sun. His hand rested on the radio console, not gripping it, not commanding through it, just resting, steady, calm. Like a man who understood that silence can sometimes speak louder than words. He remembered the years when every call for help had to travel north, to Paris, Brussels, Washington. When answers always arrived too late, or not at all. When villages burned while diplomats drafted statements. When children cried as their parents whispered they told us peace was coming. But that night, there would be no waiting. Behind him in the convoy, 6 VN-22B fire support vehicles, 4 SR-5 long-range rocket launchers, 2 command carriers with integrated battle systems, 14 tactical supply trucks. And inside those crates was something more dangerous than any weapon. Proof that dependency was a choice, not a destiny. These were not gifts, not loans, not aid packages with fine print written in foreign capitals. They were paid for cash through the National Sovereignty Fund, created in 2024 from Burkina Faso's own gold exports after the last Western training missions left behind empty barracks and broken radios. For decades, Africa asked for tools and received excuses. That night, Africa bought its own tools. This was not Chinese influence. It was African initiative. The waiting had ended. Traoré had seen the aftermath of Western withdrawal. Empty bases, rusting vehicles, villages defending themselves with farming tools, children who no longer laughed because sound attracts danger. He remembered the silence in the eyes of mothers who had lost everything except fear. That silence was louder than gunfire. And it echoed in his mind when the convoy engines started. A crackle flickered across an abandoned French military frequency. Static, then nothing. "Keep moving," Trower said. Every kilometer forward was a refusal. Every kilometer said, "We will defend ourselves not because we were permitted to, but because permission is the language of the powerless." When Western analysts finally noticed, reports trickled in quietly, almost apologetically. Unconfirmed movement, unusual pattern, potential destabilizing purchase. But they could not change the truth. A small African nation had executed a multi-million-dollar defense procurement without Western banks, without Western supervision, without Western approval. To some, it was unthinkable. To the Sahel, it was inevitable. For decades, sovereignty existed only on paper, a word spoken in speeches, not lived in reality. But that night, sovereignty became steel on wheels. The hangar dawn broke as the convoy reached a fortified hangar north of the capital. Engines shut down one by one, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt alive. The young lieutenant looked at the vehicles, barely able to speak. "We finally own something that can defend us." Trower shook his head. "No," he said, "we finally own the right to defend ourselves." Outside, the desert wind carried those words toward the horizon. By morning, they would echo across Africa. To the west, it would be a footnote. To Africans, it was a turning point 60 years in the making. Because history does not always begin with revolutions or declarations. Sometimes it begins with an engine in the dark. And the decision to keep it running. The questions that followed. Inside the presidential compound, the National Security Council convened. Exhaustion on every face. A map of the Sahel behind them, its borders drawn by colonial hands that never touched its soil. "How much longer?" Trower asked. "Do we wait for someone else to protect what is ours?" Silence filled the room. It was the only answer they needed. France had ended Operation Barkhane. Europe froze training funds. The U.S. retreated into satellite observations. What they left behind were empty runways, expired promises, and polite indifference. Waiting had become deadly. So Trower built a strategy on necessity, the doctrine of necessity. The National Sovereignty Fund was established, $250 million financed not by donors but by Burkina Faso resources. And with it came a doctrine. Buy security, not borrow it. Build sovereignty, not request it. The country shifted eastward not out of ideology, but out of practicality. China delivered equipment, not lectures, training, not conditions, respect, not permission slips. Western analysts wrote papers. They debated China's militarization of Africa, as if Africa were a chessboard instead of a continent. They asked the wrong question, not why China, but why did Africa stop asking us? The answer was simple. Because protection that must be earned is protection that can be revoked. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES. By late 2025, the convoy had become more than a military operation. It had become a doctrine, a model, a movement. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. 3 nations formed the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. Not a traditional military pact, but a shared architecture of survival. 3 flags. One principle: sovereignty cannot be borrowed, only claimed. Joint defense coordination, shared intelligence networks, unified operational command, not supervised by foreign advisors, but led by officers born in the Sahel, shaped by its heat, hardened by its dust, and anchored by its people. The doctrine of deterrence through discipline was born. Every soldier trained not just in tactics but in restraint. International monitors were invited, not to control but to verify. Because true strength is not only in the weapon, but in the wisdom to use it. The West reacts. Washington called AES a strategic anomaly. Paris called it a dangerous illusion of sovereignty. But the truth was simpler. The West was not afraid of Chinese weapons. It was afraid of African confidence. For decades, Africa's security narrative was written elsewhere. Now Africa was writing its own chapters. One American veteran wrote online, "They remind me of us, once." The world began to understand. This was not East versus West, not Cold War 2.0, not ideology versus ideology. It was memory, identity. The reclaiming of a role Africa had been denied, a continent not waiting to rise but choosing to. A new Sahel. By late 2025, local engineers repaired imported vehicles. Students studied radar systems, not as theory but reality. The Sovereignty Fund grew past $3 billion. Roads were rebuilt not by foreign contractors but by local crews. Villages once abandoned were patrolled again. Billboards across the Sahel read, "Security, sovereignty, shared prosperity." Some doubted, some warned, some whispered of sanctions. Trower simply said, "If progress offends those who preferred our dependency, let offense be the price of dignity." The final question. Freedom, it turned out, was not a moment, not a speech, not a treaty. It was a discipline, renewed every dawn. The convoy that crossed the desert that night was more than steel, more than strategy, more than geopolitics. It was the first breath of a continent awakening. And so the question remains, when a nation learns to defend itself, can it also learn to define itself? The Sahel had answered, yes. Then the world will adjust or be left behind.